The first thing you need to understand about Corporal James Holloway is that he wasn't a hero when he arrived on Okinawa. He was just tired. It was April 1st, 1945, and the landing craft was pitching in the surf like a drunk horse. Around him, 19 other Marines were vomiting into their helmets or praying into their rifles. The smell was a mixture of diesel fuel, seawater, and fear. Holloway sat near the stern, one hand gripping the gunwale, the other wrapped around a weapon that nobody else in the boat would have chosen to carry. It was a Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun, 12-gauge, 5-round capacity, a farmer's gun, a duck hunter's companion, and according to the 18-year-old private sitting across from him, the stupidest thing Holloway could have brought to a real war. The kid's name was Reynolds. He had a fresh M1 Garand slung across his chest, and he'd been staring at Holloway's shotgun for the last 20 minutes with a mixture of confusion and contempt. Finally, as the landing craft ground against the coral reef and the ramp began to drop, Reynolds leaned over and shouted over the roar of the ocean, "What the hell are you going to do with that thing, Corporal?" "Hunt ducks." Holloway didn't answer. He just checked the safety, made sure the chamber was loaded, and stepped into the waist-deep water. The beach was chaos. Mortar rounds were walking up and down the shoreline, throwing geysers of sand and shrapnel into the air. Men were running, crawling, dragging wounded buddies toward the relative safety of seawall 200 yards inland. Holloway moved with his squad, keeping low, his boots sinking into the wet sand with every step. They made it to the seawall. They made it through the first day. They made it through the second day. And every single hour of those 48 hours, someone made a comment about the bird gun. The joke started small. A sergeant asked if Holloway was planning to bag a pheasant for dinner. A machine gunner suggested they tie the shotgun to a stick and use it as a scarecrow to frighten the Japanese away. Even a lieutenant, a college-educated officer from Virginia, who carried a compass and quoted Clausewitz, made a comment about how Holloway's weapon might be better suited for a hunting lodge than a battlefield. Holloway took it all in silence. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just cleaned his shotgun every night with the same methodical care that a sniper would give to a scope. He wiped down the barrel with an oiled rag. He checked the action for grit. He counted his shells. He had 60 rounds of double-aught buckshot, each shell loaded with 9 lead pellets the size of .32 caliber bullets. Reynolds, the private who had mocked him on the boat, kept up the harassment. Every morning, when the squad formed up for the daily push inland, Reynolds would make quacking sounds. He'd waddle behind Holloway, flapping his arms like wings. The other men laughed. It was good for morale. It kept their minds off the bodies they'd seen stacked like cordwood near the aid station. But Holloway knew something they didn't. He'd read the after-action reports from Tarawa and Peleliu. He'd talked to the veterans who'd survived the caves and bunkers of Saipan. He knew that this war wasn't being fought at 300 yards with precision rifles and aimed fire. It was being fought at arm's length, in tunnels and trenches, in spaces so tight you could smell the enemy's breath before you saw his face. The M1 Garand was a magnificent weapon. It could punch through a steel helmet at half a mile. It was a rifle that won the war in Europe, where battles were fought across open fields and hedgerows. But Okinawa wasn't Europe. Okinawa was a claustrophobic nightmare of interconnected caves, spider holes, and fortified positions designed to force the Americans into knife-fighting range. And in that kind of fight, Holloway knew that a 43-inch rifle was about as useful as a flagpole. The turning point came on the morning of April 19th. The company had been ordered to take a ridge system that intelligence had labeled Hill 178. It didn't look like much from a distance, just a low, brush-covered rise in the landscape. But as they got closer, they realized the hill was honeycombed with Japanese defensive positions. Trenches zigzagged across the slope like broken veins. Bunkers made of coral and concrete sat half buried in the earth. Their firing slits angled to create overlapping fields of fire. The first assault went badly. The Marines charged up the slope and were met with a wall of machine gun fire that cut them down like wheat. The survivors retreated to the base of the hill, dragging their wounded with them. The second assault went worse. A flanking maneuver was ambushed by Japanese soldiers who popped out of spider holes and threw grenades into the advancing column. By noon, the company had lost 40 men and hadn't gained a single inch of ground. The captain, a hard-faced veteran named Morrow, was sitting in a shell crater with a map spread across his knees, trying to figure out how to crack the Japanese defense without losing his entire command. Holloway was in the same crater, reloading his shotgun. He'd fired a few rounds that morning, scattering a group of Japanese infiltrators who tried to work their way behind the American lines during the confusion of the assault. The buckshot had done its job. The infiltrators were gone. Captain Morrow looked up from his map and noticed Holloway's weapon. He stared at it for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. Then he called over the lieutenant. "You see that?" Morrow pointed at the shotgun. "That's what we need for those trenches." The lieutenant looked skeptical. "Sir, with respect, that's a hunting gun. It doesn't have a range to—" "I don't need range," Morrow interrupted. "I need something that can clear a trench without my men having to aim. Look at this." He jabbed his finger at the map. "The Japanese have 4 defensive lines running across this hill. They're connected by communication trenches. If we try to clear them with rifles, we're going to lose 10 men for every 20 yards we take. But if we put a shotgun at the front of the column, we can sweep those trenches clean." He looked at Holloway. "Corporal, how many shells do you have left?" 42, sir." "Good. You're going first." Reynolds, who had been crouched nearby, looked up in alarm. "Sir, you can't be serious. That's a bird gun. It's the right tool for the job," Morrow said flatly. "And unless you want to be the first man into that trench with your Garand, I suggest you shut your mouth and follow the corporal's lead." The assault began at 1,400 hours. This time, there was no frontal charge. Instead, Morrow ordered a smoke screen to cover the advance. Canisters of white phosphorus were lobbed onto the slope, creating a thick, choking fog that obscured the American movement. Under cover of the smoke, Holloway and a squad of 8 men began crawling up the hill. They moved slowly, carefully, using every fold in the terrain to stay hidden. The Japanese machine guns fired blindly into the smoke, the tracers cutting through the white clouds like red needles. But Holloway's squad stayed low, and the bullets passed harmlessly overhead. It took them 30 minutes to reach the first trench. Holloway could hear voices inside, Japanese soldiers shouting to each other, trying to coordinate their defense through the smoke. He crouched at the edge of the trench, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. This was the moment where the bird gun would either prove itself or get him killed. He pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it into the trench. The explosion was muffled by the earthen walls, but the screams that followed were clear enough. Holloway didn't wait. He jumped into the trench, landing boots first in 6 inches of muddy water. The first thing he saw was a Japanese soldier stumbling toward him, his ears ringing from a grenade blast, his rifle raised. Holloway didn't have time to think. He just pulled the trigger. The Winchester roared. The muzzle flash lit up the smoke-filled trench like a camera flash. The soldier was lifted off his feet and slammed backward into the trench wall. Holloway pumped the slide. The spent shell ejected in a lazy arc, splashing into the water. He swung the barrel to the right and fired again. Another soldier went down. This was where the shotgun became something more than a weapon. This was where it became an execution device. In the narrow confines of the trench, there was no room to dodge. The spread of the buckshot filled the entire width of the passage. You didn't have to aim. You just pointed in the general direction of the enemy and pulled the trigger. Holloway moved forward, pumping and firing. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of explosions that echoed off the earthen walls. Behind him, Reynolds and the others dropped into the trench, their rifles ready, but there was nothing left to shoot. Holloway had already cleared 30 yards of trench in less than 20 seconds. They reached the first corner. Holloway paused, breathing hard. His ears were ringing. The barrel of the shotgun was hot enough to steam in the damp air. He could hear movement around the corner, the sound of boots splashing through water, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being worked. He didn't peek around the corner. That was how you got your head shot off. Instead, he stuck the barrel of the shotgun around the corner at waist height and fired blind. He pumped the slide and fired again. Then he swung around the corner, low and fast. 3 Japanese soldiers were down. 2 were dead. One was crawling toward a discarded rifle, his legs shattered by the buckshot. Holloway fired one more time, ending it. Reynolds came up behind him, his face pale. "Jesus Christ, Corporal." Holloway didn't respond. He was already reloading, his fingers working automatically, feeding fresh shells into the magazine tube. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He'd just killed 5 men in the span of 30 seconds, and he felt nothing. No guilt, no triumph. Just a cold, mechanical efficiency that frightened him more than the enemy ever could. They pushed deeper into the trench system. The second line was better fortified. The trenches here were reinforced with wooden beams and sandbags. There were firing steps cut into the walls, and small alcoves where soldiers could take cover from artillery. It was a professional piece of military engineering, designed to withstand bombardment and resist assault. But the Japanese defenders hadn't planned for the trench broom. They'd positioned themselves at intervals along the trench, expecting to engage attackers with rifle fire at a distance. They hadn't expected a man with a shotgun to come around the corner and erase them at point-blank range. Holloway cleared the second line in 10 minutes. He moved like a machine, his movements precise and brutal. Corner, fire, pump, fire, move. Corner, fire, pump, fire, move. The rhythm became automatic. His shoulder was bruising from the recoil, but he didn't feel it. His ears had stopped working properly, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that drowned out everything except the sound of his own breathing and the mechanical clack-clack of the pump action. The third line was where things went wrong. Holloway came around a corner and found himself face-to-face with a Japanese officer holding a sword. The officer was fast. He swung the blade in a horizontal arc, aiming for Holloway's neck. Holloway jerked backward, and the blade missed by inches, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. There was no time to bring the shotgun to bear. The officer was already winding up for a second swing. Holloway did the only thing he could. He used the shotgun like a club. He swung the heavy walnut stock in a brutal upward arc that caught the officer under the chin. The man's head snapped back with a sickening crack, and he dropped like a stone. Holloway stood there, breathing hard, staring at the crumpled body. His shotgun stock was cracked. He could see a jagged split running through the wood. He tested the action. It still worked. The gun was still functional. He kept moving. The fourth trench was a command post. Holloway could tell by the way it was constructed. The walls were higher, the floor was drier, and there were wooden crates stacked against the sides, filled with ammunition and supplies. There were also more soldiers. A lot more. Holloway counted 8 of them as he came around the final corner. They were gathered around a map table, pointing and arguing. They looked up when they heard his boots in the water. For a split second, everyone froze. Then Holloway started shooting. He held the trigger down and pumped the slide as fast as his arm could move. The Winchester barked 5 times in 3 seconds. The room filled with smoke and blood, and the smell of cordite. When the slide locked back on an empty chamber, Holloway dropped to one knee and started reloading. That was when Reynolds and the rest of the squad finally caught up. They came around the corner, their rifles raised, and stopped dead at the sight. The command post looked like a slaughterhouse. The map table was overturned. Papers were scattered everywhere, soaked in blood and mud. The walls were pockmarked with buckshot holes. Reynolds lowered his rifle slowly. He looked at Holloway, who was calmly feeding shells into the shotgun's magazine tube, his face spattered with mud and blood. "Holy shit," Reynolds whispered. Holloway finished reloading. He stood up, his legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked at Reynolds and saw something different in the kid's eyes. The mockery was gone. The jokes were gone. In their place was something that looked like fear. Not fear of the enemy. Fear of Holloway. "Trench is clear," Holloway said quietly. "Let's move up." They climbed out of the fourth trench and signaled the rest of the company. Within minutes, Marines were pouring up the slope, securing the position. Captain Morrow arrived with the second wave. He walked through the trenches, his face expressionless, taking in the devastation. When he reached the command post, he stopped and stared for a long moment. Then he walked over to Holloway, who was sitting on an ammunition crate, cleaning his shotgun. Morrow didn't say anything at first. He just pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Holloway. They smoked in silence while the company medics moved through the trenches, checking for wounded. Finally, Morrow spoke. "How many shells did you use?" 38. Morrow nodded. He looked at the crack stock of the shotgun. "That thing still work?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm requisitioning 5 more for the battalion. I want one shotgun with every assault squad from now on." The word spread fast. By evening, every man in the company knew what had happened on Hill 178. They knew that Corporal Holloway had cleared 4 Japanese trench lines with a bird gun. They knew that he'd killed more enemy soldiers in 30 minutes than most riflemen killed in a month. Reynolds never made another duck joke. In fact, he never spoke to Holloway again unless spoken to first. The mockery had died in those trenches, replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable respect. Holloway didn't feel victorious. He felt empty. That night, sitting in his foxhole while the rain came down in sheets, he took apart the Winchester and cleaned every piece with obsessive care. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the realization of what he had become. The war ended 4 months later. Holloway went home to Oregon. He married his high school sweetheart. He worked as a mechanic. He had 2 daughters. He never talked about Okinawa. When his friends invited him to go bird hunting in the fall, he always declined. He told them his back hurt. He told them he was too busy. The truth was simpler. He couldn't stand the sound of a pump-action shotgun anymore. The Winchester stayed in his garage, locked in a cabinet, wrapped in oilcloth. He never fired again. Holloway died in 1998. He was 75 years old. At his funeral, his grandson asked if anyone knew why Grandpa had kept that old shotgun locked away for 50 years. Nobody had an answer. This is why we tell these stories. Because the men who did the impossible don't write books about themselves. They don't brag. They just do the work, come home, and try to forget. But we shouldn't forget. The story of the bird gun that cleared 4 trenches deserves to be remembered. The story of the man who ignored the experts and trusted his instincts deserves to be told. If you believe these stories matter, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real heroism still counts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. We're building a library of the forgotten, a monument to the men who did the work when the world was burning. Leave a comment if your grandfather served in the Pacific. Tell us what he carried. Tell us his story. We want to hear it. Holloway is gone now, but the echo of that pump action still rings in the history books. Clack, clack. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next trench.